The chest pain started while I was watering the tomatoes in my backyard, a tight band pulling across my ribs so suddenly that I dropped the hose and sat down hard on the porch steps, gasping, certain for one long terrifying moment that I was going to die alone in my own yard with nobody knowing where I was. I managed to crawl inside to my phone and called my daughter Jessica first, because that's what you do, isn't it? When your body starts failing you at 61 years old, you call your child. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail again. I called her husband, Tyler, next, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady, and that call went to voicemail too, on the second ring this time, like it had been declined rather than missed. I dialed 911 myself, alone on my kitchen floor, and told the operator my chest felt like it was being crushed by something with no intention of letting go. The paramedics found me still on that floor 20 minutes later, my phone still clutched in my hand, screen dimmed but unlocked, the last dialed number still glowing at the top of the call log like proof of something I hadn't yet found the words for. The last thing I remember before the ambulance doors closed was trying my daughter's number one more time, praying she'd pick up before they took my phone away to hook up the monitors, and hearing that same cheerful voicemail greeting she recorded years ago. The one that says, "Hey, it's Jess, leave a message, love you," in a voice that used to mean something to me every single time I heard it. I want you to understand something about who I am before I tell you what happened in that emergency room, because I need you to know I'm not someone who complains easily, not someone who calls herself a victim without cause. I raised Jessica alone after her father left when she was 4, worked 2 jobs for most of her childhood, a daytime job at an insurance office and weekend shifts waitressing, so that she could have dance lessons and new school clothes, and a mother who showed up to every recital even running on no sleep. I sold my wedding ring the year she needed braces because the orthodontist's payment plan still wasn't enough to cover it, and I refused to let her go through high school with crooked teeth she'd resent me for later. I drove 3 hours each way, twice a month, during her 4 years of college, just to sit in her dorm parking lot with a trunk full of groceries and home-cooked meals because I knew the dining hall food never agreed with her stomach and I couldn't stand the thought of her going hungry. I am not a woman who asks for much. I have never once, in 34 years of being her mother, called her needy or dramatic or difficult, though God knows there were nights I could have used the help and didn't ask because I didn't want to be a burden to a young woman building her own life. That's the mother she was calling, over and over, from a hospital gurney, and getting silence in return. They wheeled me into the ER around 9 that evening, hooked me to a heart monitor, drew blood to check for enzymes that would tell them whether I was actually having a heart attack or something less catastrophic, and told me it would be at least a few hours before they knew anything for certain. I lay there under fluorescent lights that made everything look the color of old paper, listening to monitors beeping around me from other curtained bays, completely alone, because there was no one else to call. My sister was on a flight to Denver and wouldn't land for hours. My oldest friend was recovering from her own surgery 2 states away. I had exactly one number I trusted enough to call in an emergency, and that number wasn't answering. Somewhere around 11 that night, a nurse handed me my phone back briefly so I could plug it into a wall charger, since it had dropped to 2%, and while it powered back up I did the thing you shouldn't do lying in a hospital bed with a heart monitor clipped to your finger. I opened Instagram. And there it was, right at the top of Jessica's page, posted 40 minutes after my first unanswered call to her, a photo of the 2 of them, her and Tyler, sitting at a restaurant table with mimosas and a plate of pastries between them, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, the caption reading, "Finally, a peaceful day with no drama. Just us." 40 minutes. 40 minutes after I'd called her from my kitchen floor with what turned out to be an actual, real, medically confirmed cardiac event, she had been sitting in a restaurant, phone clearly in reach, close enough to hold it up for a photo, close enough to type out a caption, close enough to see 2 missed calls from her mother and choose to caption a brunch photo instead of calling back. I lay there with the phone screen glowing in the dim hospital bay and felt something crack open in me that had nothing to do with my heart monitor. Because I understood, reading that caption, exactly what no drama meant in that sentence. It meant me. It meant that somewhere in the last several years, without my fully realizing it, I had become the drama in my own daughter's life, the thing to be managed and minimized and, on a good day, avoided entirely so she could enjoy her mimosas in peace. I thought back over the last year, searching for when exactly that shift had happened, and I found it easily enough once I started looking, the way you always can once you stop protecting yourself from seeing something clearly. 6 months earlier I'd asked, gently, whether they might visit more than twice a year, since I lived only 40 minutes away, and Jessica had accused me, almost word for word, of guilt-tripping her, of making everything a whole thing. 3 months before that, I'd mentioned, once, that Tyler's mother seemed to get invited to every holiday while I got invited to alternating ones, and Jessica had told me I was being dramatic and competitive over nothing. There was the time I'd asked if they could help me move a bookshelf and Jessica had sighed audibly into the phone before agreeing, making sure I understood the favor cost her something. There was the birthday dinner I'd planned for myself last year, a small thing, for people at a restaurant I liked, and they'd canceled 2 hours beforehand for a work thing that turned out, according to a mutual friend, to have been a spontaneous trip to the lake with Tyler's college friends. Every time I had expressed a need, however small, however reasonable, it had been repackaged and handed back to me as evidence that I was difficult. And I had believed it, because that's what happens when the person doing the labeling is someone you love enough to trust completely. The cardiologist came by around 1 in the morning and told me the enzymes had come back elevated, that I'd had what they called a mild cardiac event, not the massive heart attack they'd feared but serious enough that I'd be admitted for observation and further testing over the next 2 days. She asked, gently, if there was anyone I wanted her to call, any family she should update. I told her no, not tonight, and watched something like pity cross her face before she caught herself and softened it into professional neutrality. I nodded, thanked her, and lay back against the pillow once she left, staring at the ceiling tiles, and made a decision in that hospital bed that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the rest of my life. I decided I was done being quietly grateful for scraps of attention from people who called my basic needs drama. I decided that the version of myself who kept score silently, who forgave instantly, who explained away every slight because explaining was easier than confronting, that version of me needed to stay behind in that hospital bed along with everything else I was leaving there. The following morning, I called my sister, who had landed and immediately called back in a panic once she saw 12 missed calls and a voicemail from the ER, and I told her everything, calmly, the whole timeline, the calls, the voicemail, the post. She was quiet for a long moment and then said something I've held on to since. Carol, you've spent your whole life making yourself small so nobody else has to feel uncomfortable. Maybe it's time you let someone else carry that for a while. I asked her to do one thing for me that day, since she couldn't fly back out yet, and she did it without hesitation. I asked her to call my attorney's office and set up an appointment for the week I was discharged, because there was language in my will, drafted 8 years earlier, naming Jessica as my sole medical proxy and primary beneficiary, and I no longer trusted that arrangement to reflect who actually showed up for me in this life. Jessica finally called at 10 the next morning, nearly 14 hours after my first attempt to reach her, her voice bright and unbothered, asking how my week was going, clearly having no idea anything had happened, which told me everything about how closely she'd actually been paying attention to those missed calls. I told her, flatly, that I'd had a cardiac event and spent the night alone in the ER because she hadn't answered her phone. There was a long silence, then a flurry of apologies, explanations about the restaurant being loud, about not seeing her phone, about how she would have come immediately if she'd known. I asked her, evenly, whether she'd seen my missed calls before or after she posted about her peaceful, drama-free day. The silence that followed that question told me everything the apology hadn't. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed, gone thin and defensive in a way I recognized instantly, the tone she used whenever she was about to turn the conversation around on me. She said she couldn't be expected to check her phone every single minute, that I was being unfair, that this was exactly the kind of guilt she'd been trying to explain to me for months, this feeling that nothing she did was ever quite enough. I sat with that accusation for a moment, turning it over, and then I told her something I'd never said to her in 34 years. I told her that I understood, finally, that she wasn't going to change, and that the only thing left for me to change was how much of myself I kept handing over to someone who treated my presence as an inconvenience to be managed around her peace. I'm out of the hospital now, recovering, my heart, both the physical one and whatever the other kind is called, healing slower than the doctors predicted but healing nonetheless. I changed my medical proxy to my sister 2 weeks after I was discharged, updated my will the same week, not out of spite, though I understand if it looks that way from the outside, but because I finally understood that the people who get to be central to your life, the ones who inherit not just your money but your trust, ought to be the ones who pick up the phone. My sister flew in the following weekend and spent 3 days on my couch, bringing me soup I didn't need and company I didn't know how badly I needed, and somewhere in the middle of that visit, sitting on my porch watching the same tomato plants I'd collapsed beside days earlier, I realized I couldn't remember the last time Jessica had simply sat with me for no reason at all, without an occasion attached, without somewhere else to be after. Jessica has called several times since, softer each time, asking to rebuild things, and I haven't shut the door entirely, because she's still my daughter and some part of me will always love her the way I loved her at 4 years old learning to ride a bike in our driveway. But I've stopped mistaking her comfort for my responsibility. I've stopped explaining my needs as though they require a defense, presenting evidence like I'm on trial for the crime of wanting to matter to my own child. And the next time someone calls my ordinary, human need for connection drama, I intend to let them enjoy their peaceful day without me in it, because I have finally learned, at 61 years old, in a hospital bed under fluorescent lights, that peace built on someone else's silence was never really peace at all. It was just quiet, and I have spent enough of my life being quiet for other people's comfort. I'm done.